Hello everyone. Good evening and a warm welcome to you to this webinar. The topic for today's webinar is role of TP53 gene in hematolymphoid malignancies and multiple myeloma. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Rahul Bhargava for organizing and coordinating this webinar. Our speaker for today is Dr. Vidya Veldor. Dr. Vidya is Principal Scientist Oncology at MedGenome Labs Limited. Before I hand over to Dr. Vidya, I wanted to inform you that if you have any questions or comments, you can type them out in the Q&A window of the Zoom conferencing browser. We will also be sending across the recording of this webinar in case you miss out on any points or would like to revisit some portions later. So without any further delay, I will now transfer the host to Dr. Vidya, who will take this webinar forward. Dr. Vidya.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Hardeep, for this, thanks to Dr. Rahul Bhargava for driving this webinar. So without much delay, I would like to start on today's presentation. As we all know, TP53 is a tumor suppressor, and it is pretty much more than 50% of all cancers have TP53 mutations, and we all know on the basics of TP53, so I won't be spending much time there. So this is the outline of my talk, and although we know that TP53 is mutated in several cancers, including leukemias, lymphomas, and myelomas, often it is associated with poor prognosis. But then in certain unique subtypes of hematolymphoid malignancies, particularly chronic lymphocytic leukemia and multiple myeloma, in the last 5 years, there has been several randomized studies which have been done, case control studies, which have proved that in deriving the TP53 mutation status at the baseline during the time of diagnostic workup plays an important role in management of these two diseases. And hence, we are going to spend more time in understanding how TP53 workup is done and what are the guidelines in CLL management and how important is TP53 in multiple myeloma. Then a few case studies, and then touch base on other subtypes of leukemia where TP53 mutation is often documented. So TP53 is also called gatekeeper or the god of human genome. It is a tumor suppressor protein, and it's involved in DNA damage, repair, and regulation of cell division. And primarily, it is the loss of function mutations in TP53 that leads to oncogenesis, and it is reported in more than 50% of human cancers. And often a loss of its primary function, that is to ensure there is a proper damage, repair has been done for any DNA damage and other aspects of cell division. If that primary function is lost, that in fact leads to gain of other functions, which is endoing the cancer cells towards malignant transformation. And here I show the chromosome 17, the P arm, and this is the particular band 17p13, wherein the gene is located. And there are about 11 exons, and the DNA binding domain of TP53 spans between exons 4 to 9. And if you look into the literature, predominantly most of the mutations are clustered in the DNA binding domain. The reason being, it is a transcription factor, and therefore it binds to DNA and regulates the switch on and switch off state of different proteins. Therefore, any mutation in this DNA binding domain will impair its property of switching on and switching off different genes. And that is how a loss of primary function in TP53 happens during the process of oncogenesis. Now moving on to TP53 mutations and CLL management. Um, it is primarily driven by a network, a research initiative from Europe. It is called ERIC recommendations, where they have given clear-cut indications on how one has to do TP53 mutation analysis and how to interpret the results of TP53 mutations in the context of chronic lymphocytic leukemia management. Why is it important to assess TP53 status in CLL? Presence of TP53 mutation or loss of function in TP53, which is derived by FISH method, wherein you look for deletion 17p, or you look at mutations in TP53 that leads to loss of function, is associated with resistance to chemoimmunotherapy and therefore poor clinical outcome. In order to select, handpick patients who are eligible for chemoimmunotherapy, one has to look at the TP53 status at the time of the initial diagnostic workup. And today, based on these ERIC recommendation as well as the standard guidelines, TP53 mutation status assessment has been incorporated into the routine clinical diagnostics for patient stratification and for therapeutic decisions. And beyond the chemoimmunotherapy, which is the standard therapy options known, there are few more, newer drug options which are coming up, which are targeting B-cell receptor and BCL2 family proteins. These are in very nascent stages. What they have seen is those patients who have TP53 defects and who cannot be subjected to chemoimmunotherapy are in fact responding to these new molecules. So these are in very nascent stages. It requires thorough clinical trials and their assessment response before it comes into routine practice. Standard method of choice used for TP53 assessment, FISH and NGS, in situ hybridization and next-gen sequencing. It has been clearly stated NGS in the recommendation, and hence I have insisted to put this as NGS. The reason being it has higher sensitivity, which we will discuss in the later slides. And it is also important because FISH gives you a gross picture on the deletion, whereas NGS will give you a higher resolution. And what people have seen in their clinical studies is about 20 to 30% of those patients who do not have deletion 17p do carry mutations in TP53. Those are the loss of function SNVs and indels. And hence there is a need for sequencing. So looking at how the subset of different CLL patients are in the context of presence or absence of TP53. There is a subgroup of patients who are positive on sequencing due to SNVs and short indels leading to loss of function in TP53. There is another subgroup of patients who are deletion 17p positive, and hence there is a loss of TP53. There is also another small subset of patients who could be positive for both TP53 mutation as well as deletion 17p. So this is just to show a schematic what we infer from a FISH method and what we would infer when we do not exact. We can do it as a complementary one after the other or together to assess. The guidelines do not say you need to do it one after the other or together. It is just trying to rule out a possibility that the patient is not positive for any TP53 loss of function. So at the in situ hybridization level, you are looking at a gross deletion of the gene, and whereas when you do sequencing, you are looking at point mutations or SNVs and indels, short indels, which could lead to loss of function. So this is another information which you would get only by sequencing. However, you would not know to discriminate between whether it is copy 1 or copy 2 unless these two mutations are very close by in a span of less than 150 to 250 bases. So how one has to take forward TP53 mutation assessment, and what are the advantages of NGS method, and that is the reason why the ERIC network has recommended NGS to handpick patients who are eligible for chemoimmunotherapy in CLL. Can I go ahead?
Yes, please, Dr.
Yeah. Okay. So back in 2018, this is the first time when a standard, clinical workup recommendation had suggested next generation sequencing as a technology because it is superior over Sanger in order to detect somatic mutations which are less than 15 to 20% in any given leukemic patient. In this case, we are looking at TP53 mutations. The reason why it enables the clinicians for better stratification, wherein those patients who have a mutation burden less than 15%, who could have been mapped as P53 wild type on Sanger, may be part of this chosen group who would not be given treatment for chemoimmunotherapy, as they would develop aggressive disease and early relapse. The guideline also gives another information that NGS is also capable of looking at mutation burden less than 1%. We need to, refresh our first webinar series where we understood the basics of NGS, what is depth, what is VAF, and MAF or mutant allele burden. It would come very handy now when we are trying to understand their TP53 mutation analysis here. So it also says that due to high sensitivity, it is able to detect convergent mutations, subclonal mutations in TP53 gene, and try to closely follow up the patient using this technology in during the course of treatment to understand the disease evolution. So this is just a slide for us to get a feel for how each technology is adding value to our understanding of the genetic material, that is DNA, and then you further look into the building blocks of the DNA or the human genome, that is the gene. So when you look at a cell under the microscope, you look for the nucleus. It broadly gives you the understanding on the morphology, the nucleus to cytoplasm ratio, how well it is contained, is it pleomorphic, and what is the shape of the nucleus, which plays an important role in different morphological examinations where they confirm leukemias. And following that, when you go a little further, there comes the cytogenetics, conventional cytogenetics, where you are looking at the packed genetic material in the form of chromosomes, that is 23 pairs. So they have again a unique structure which is identified by banding. And if there is any variation from a healthy chromosomal map, that indicates that there is a possibility of some underlying disease, and that is how one arrives at unique patterns which are again associated with different types of leukemias. Then moving further, interface FISH. So this is done on both different types like blood, bone marrow, as well as FFPE block when validated. Here what we are looking at is large chunks of DNA, not necessarily as large as a big P arm or a Q arm of chromosome, slightly shorter than that, but you are covering a bunch of genes all put together in a large chunk of DNA. We are trying to infer whether there are two copies present or not, or there are multiple copies beyond two. This is what we try to understand in the FISH level. Here, the technology remains microscopy, So you are still able to appreciate the malignant cell, I mean the leukemic cell. You are still able to appreciate the nuclear morphology and also the cellular components before you start processing the slide to understand the large deletions in the genome. Um, a little further, there is a MLPA, multiplex ligation probe amplification. Here, you are not looking at the cell morphology. It is ruptured, the DNA is taken out, and we are doing PCR as a technology here. So we cannot appreciate any nuclear morphology, anything here, but it goes to a slightly much higher resolution than what FISH would offer us in looking at slightly smaller regions, maybe a few hundred base pairs to a few kilobases, to understand whether smaller chunks within the gene, like few exons, let us say the gene has 24 exons, uh, are we seeing the first 10 exons, or are we seeing the exons between 3 to 13 are getting deleted? For that, you can use this particular technology to understand deletions and duplications. Then moving forward, we have DNA sequencing. It can happen with next-gen sequencing or with Sanger. The idea of next-gen sequencing is higher sensitivity. To opt for this is with higher sensitivity, which we have said this time and again. Pretty much in today's the clinical diagnostic workup, most of the time Sanger limits its application towards germline analysis, whereas NGS is used in both in the context of somatic and germline. This is where you get the highest resolution of the genetic information, that is the ATGC information, which is pretty much lost in all these technologies. And this is where you get the information at the molecular level and at the atomic level to understand the protein structure and function, which is the workhorse of any transformation in a cell. In this case, we are looking at malignancy. So quickly moving on back to our CLL story and where we stand. So we said that FISH is the method of choice as well as NGS to rule out different types of uh, mutations that can happen. By FISH, of course, you are looking at a pretty large chunk of DNA being deleted. And whereas with NGS, we are looking at a high resolution. So what we require in the context of sample requirements for deletion 17p, we require peripheral blood or bone marrow in heparin, and viability is very important. It should reach within 24 hours ambient temperature, and cell count, presence of blast is very important for successful FISH results. And these are the important markers which are assessed often as a a group of markers which are assessed for CLL workup. When it comes to TP53 mutation analysis by NGS, uh, uh, we accept peripheral blood in EDTA. But however, if the lymphocyte count is low, we would prefer bone marrow aspirate in EDTA. Very rarely, we should avoid lymph node biopsies in FFPE. But if there is nothing available, the patient is already on treatment, and initial sample was pretty old and we do not have anything with us, then if there is any preserved lymph node biopsy, we can take. However, it comes with its own challenges, and that is what is mentioned below here. So with FFPE DNA, due to fixation artifacts, we have several challenges in terms of integral DNA being obtained, because of which, due to chemical fixation induced artifacts, can result in false positive, or sometimes when the DNA is heavily degraded, you may not be able to adequately sequence the chunk of DNA, like what we understood earlier about the depth. How many different clones or how many different fragments of DNA are sequenced in order to arrive at true positive results and not false negative. So again, getting back to TP53 mutations. So one of the important worldwide approved databases is in France, where they have tried to collate the mutation information of TP53 gene across all cancers. And they keep updating their database to understand where all this gene gets mutated in order to, result in the onset of cancer. So what we find here is often the mutations are clustered between exons 4 to 8 that constitutes the DNA binding domain, and which is the important functional domain for TP53 to bind the DNA and ensure that there is repair and the cell get back to the normal. And once this region gets mutated, the P53 loses its function, and that is how the cancer is onset. So I will, just this is another small information which was told before in our previous sessions, but again re-insisting on this because ERIC recommendation suggests that you have to sequence the complete TP53 gene. In addition to that, you have to sequence the splice variants, canonical positions. So you need to see, this is the exon, 2 nucleotides after the end of the exon, these 2 positions, and 2 nucleotides before the start of the exon. These are the 2 splice site positions. They also need to be sequenced because they are very important in RNA splicing mechanism that might lead to protein, inactive P53 protein, which has lost its property to do the native function. So ERIC recommendation also talks about how much should be the depth of sequencing that TP53 gene has to be, processed in any given clinical setting. A minimum of 100x depth is recommended, and at a given variant position with mutation, the variant reads or the mutant reads should be at least 10x at that at the location where we are looking for a mutation. And in terms of the coverage of the gene that covers all the exons, more than 99% coverage is expected as far as ERIC recommendation goes in TP53 gene sequencing. And they also recommend that the assay should be validated with an LOD of at least 10% and above. So it also talks about how variants are reported. This we have extensively discussed in our earlier basics of NGS session. I'm not going to go into details here. So there is a universally approved nomenclature for reporting genetic mutations. This is called HGVS nomenclature. That is what we follow and several diagnostic labs follow. And that is how one has to report a TP53 mutation. And the first source where one has to look for whether a given mutation is pathogenic or not, the recommendation is these 2 databases, following which we can look at the other sources to understand the pathogenicity of the mutation documented in literature. So everything remains evidence-based here. If the mutation is very well studied at the in clinical cohorts as well as with biochemical information, that becomes a strong evidence for the variant to be a pathogenic variant. And another important thing here, which we wanted to bring up is, if a given variant allele burden is greater than 30%, one has to rule out a possibility of germline predisposition in the TP53 gene, for which a buccal swab source is recommended to rule out the predisposition. This we have already discussed about the splice. And when do you call it that this patient is positive for a TP53 mutation? As per the ERIC recommendation, you can call a patient sample as positive for TP53 mutation only when the mutant allele burden or variant allele fraction. That is what this particular recommendation ERIC publication uses as nomenclature, is greater than 10%. That does not stop us from reporting mutations which are less than 10% and above 5%. They can still be reported. However, it has to go with a note saying that for those mutations which are detected below 10%, we do not have adequate support from clinical studies, prospective clinical studies, to determine the prognosis for the CLL management. Now, moving on to multiple myeloma and TP53 testing. Can I pause here or go ahead, sir? Okay. So on the same lines, like what we discussed in CLL, in multiple myeloma, the revised risk stratification of multiple myeloma that came up in the year 2015 discusses about combining biochemical parameters like beta 2 microglobulin and serum beta 2 microglobulin, serum lactate dehydrogenase, along with these 4 chromosomal anomalies together are important for risk stratification of multiple myeloma. So why is it important? Again, here, patients with 17p deletion are associated with poor prognosis and disease progression. Therefore, it is very important to assess the mutations as well as deletion 17p or the TP53 status in multiple myeloma patients. So way back, the earlier staging information or the risk stratification was back in 2005, where they looked at these 3 parameters independently, that is beta 2 microglobulin, and of course conventional cytogenetics was also there, and then serum lactate dehydrogenase levels. But then over there, they did not bring a compound factor of those patients who have this plus this minus this, or this plus this, or different permutations and combinations were not assessed at that point of time. So the recent study which we have in 2015 talks about how one can look at risk stratification combining all the 3 parameters. So standard risk or low risk group of multiple myeloma, where beta 2 microglobulin levels is less than 3.5 milligrams per liter, serum albumin is greater than 3.5, and none of the cytogenetic anomalies are present, that is absence of deletion 17p and the other translocations, and normal LDH levels. These patients do very well in terms of their progression-free survival as well as overall survival. Whereas the high-risk group is defined by beta 2 microglobulin level being greater than 5.5 with one of these markers, either deletion 17p or 414 translocation or 1416 translocation, or all 3 could be present with of course, or high LDH levels. There is an intermediate category. Here, the publication just mentions that permutations and combinations of these 3 parameters were taken into consideration in this cohort. However, they did not specifically say what are the combinations that was taken. So their prognosis is intermediate as compared to the standard risk and the high risk group. So here again, as we saw back in CLL management, there are again 3 distinct group of patients with both deletion 17 and a mutation, or just a mutation alone, or just the deletion 17p alone. So one of the queries which were asked while registration was also this, that how many different subsets of TP53 dysregulation, or rather different types of mutations, are present. So monoallelic deletions, that is this particular group, constitutes about 8%, and these only mutations constitute 6%, whereas this constitutes about 4%. However, when you look at the clinical outcome, this publication on the risk stratification, where they have taken more than 1,500 patients, they have seen that monoallelic loss is associated with poor outcome, as well as another group of patients with biallelic loss. So sample requirements, again, for deletion 17p fish by multiple myeloma. Here, the first bone marrow in heparin, peripheral blood is not recommended, but and the sample should reach the lab within 24 hours in ambient temperature. Plasma cell count is estimated by in-house pathologist, and then we have a plasma cell separation with the CD138, using anti-CD138 antibody. And that enriched plasma cell is what is subjected to fluorescence in situ hybridization for all these markers. So this is, based on this particular study, they have tried to summarize how the overall survival is different in the different risk groups: low, standard risk, high risk, and the intermediate risk group. This is the high risk group, and they don't perform very well. And then we have the low risk or the standard risk, and then we have the intermediate risk category. Alternate testing strategies for large deletions. There was another independent publication from the UK, which they have used instead of in situ hybridization, multiplex ligation dependent amplification. This is again a very large study on 1,777 patients newly diagnosed multiple myeloma. They have used MLPA to understand minor clones, minor subclones of TP53 deletion, how these cohort of individuals are associated with clinical outcome. Presence of this biomarker and clinical outcome was assessed retrospectively to see whether this has any role to play in the prognosis of the disease. So what they found was subclonal TP53 deletions were independently associated with shorter overall survival, and clonal but not the subclonal mutations, deletions, that is what you assess based on FISH method, are associated with the clinical markers of advanced disease, like what we look at in the biochemical parameters as well as the morphological parameters, where one assesses the platelet count and lactate dehydrogenase and other parameters. So here they also talk about how rare is biallelic loss of function mutation in this cohort of multiple myeloma patients. So to conclude, based on this study, they don't recommend. However, they have proved that another parallel technology, that is MLPA, can be used to assess subclonal TP53 deletions. This could be used as an option in those patients where for some reason the bone marrow heparin is not viable and we lose the material for some reason, technical reason or non-technical reason. And if we have the DNA with us, we can still look at subclonal TP53 deletions by MLPA. So this is an example, it's for a different gene. I just wanted to show here how one looks at the raw data of an MLPA experiment. There's something called as dosage quotient. It often oscillates between zero point 0.8 to 1.2 for reference genes. But however, when there is a deletion, the value goes below 0.8. And when there is a duplication or an amplification event, the value crosses the threshold of 1.2. And this is what has been summarized here. That is how one tries to understand the different terminologies here. If the quotient is between 0.8 to 1.2, it is normal. If there is a homozygous deletion, it is pretty much around 0 here. And then heterozygous deletion, how it varies, and so on. So here again, the validation for these proofs are done and then these measures, or rather these thresholds, are provided in the context of germline. When it comes to somatic, that is in the context of leukemia or cancer, it is primarily driven by the percentage of tumor cells and how many of these tumor cells actually carry the mutation. This I have already discussed before. And moving on to the question answers, some of the questions were raised during the webinar registration. Do we need to check for TP53 deletion by FISH and its mutation by NGS in all cases of CLL? So here we offer both the methods. Now, it is left to the clinician, and I would say it is completely institutional practice, whether they would like to look at both the aspects together or look at one after the other. So this is completely there is no recommendation as such. It can be done as a reflex or complementary testing, or it can be done together. TP53 mutation analysis is done as a routine for do we do that? Yes, we do offer this testing for those patients who are referred, multiple myeloma patients who are referred for this test at MedGenome. What is the frequency of P53 aberration in multiple myeloma? So that is what we earlier discussed in our slides, and I have summarized here again. Is inhibition of apoptosis the major effect of P53 aberration? This is one of the biological processes that gets affected when P53 loses its function. But there could be other aspects also. Because of the loss of TP53, several other signaling pathways may also be inactivated. So what is the antibody or the drug which targets mutant TP53? So we can use them in those cancers. So far, none of the drugs or even antibodies are FDA approved with very strong clinical evidence that one can use it. It is still in research mode and also in clinical trials. Role of TP53 in MDS. What's the better way to test? TP53 by IHC, PCR, or FISH? So FISH and NGS, or rather PCR, could be the primary choice, where we are looking at DNA level information, which indirectly gives us an idea about loss of function in TP53. IHC will only tell us that there is increased expression or high staining of TP53. High staining of TP53 does not always mean that there is very high active expression of TP53. When TP53 is mutated, it might become what we call as inclusion bodies or precipitates inside the cell, in the nucleus or in the cytoplasm, because of which there is high staining. But it may not be functionally active TP53. So it is, again, it has been very well studied at the IHC level by pathologists, what it means when there is an increased expression of P53 on IHC, how it prognosticates or how you subcategorize a given lymphoma is known, but there is no, I mean, I wouldn't say that one has to use IHC for an MDS or something like that. In which condition repeat assay should be sent? Time interval after diagnosis for the prognostic purpose. Any guidelines? The ERIC recommendation in context of CLL or even the multiple myeloma recommendation do not specifically mention anywhere about the time frame. I would say it's again institution driven based on each individual clinician's SOP and protocol. It might vary. Just quickly touch base on 3 or 4 clinical studies. Before moving on to clinical studies, we haven't touched upon the other leukemias and lymphomas where TP53 is known. Since this TP53 is such a vast subject, we cannot finish this in 45-minute session. It requires elaborate session for each aspect. However, grossly, as I mentioned in the first slide, pretty much more or less wherever TP53 loss of function is there, it is associated with poor clinical outcome or poor prognosis in most of the leukemias and lymphomas. To list out a few, which we have gone through the guidelines, particularly the WHO guidelines, where different clinical clinical studies were documented by several research groups where they looked at on what indications TP53 mutations were noted. So just to list out a few of these here: DLBCL, AML with myelodysplasia related changes, MDS with excess blast and multi-lineage dysplasia, CML when it is in blast crisis or an accelerated phase. Therapy related MDS, MPN, AML, most often it is the driver is TP53 mutation. And a small subset of familial MDS AML is also known. Leaf-Ramoni, as the syndrome itself suggests, are predominantly TP53 mutated. And a few like double hit lymphomas, when they develop the aggressive phenotype, is often driven by a new clonal expansion due to TP53 mutation, and several others. So this is just one of the case studies of AML. I just want to mention here, the diagnosis does not clearly state it is AML MRC, but it says AML with morphological dysplasia. So this we found that there was almost 97.2% burden of TP53 in this patient. So considering that basic information, clinical information that was provided, we often try to curate or rather give a clinical interpretation for the presence of this mutation and how it would help the clinician in further stratifying the patient. We have given the information available in the literature in the context of MDS as well as AML. And where all, if there is any information on its presence or absence indicated in response to therapy, standard therapy. So here, this is one study where they clearly state TP53 mutation with coexisting complex karyotype. So is associated with the worst clinical outcome. So prior knowledge of cytogenetics is also important. NGS alone may not be able to stratify patients. It is a combined workup, as we always do with the leukemias and lymphomas, that is start with morphology and different technology platforms. Each one has its own value addition. So when we give risk stratification, it is a combined factorial equation of different answers from different technologies that will add value to the risk stratification. So this is a case of BLL, a child for 12-year-old. It was harboring a TP53 mutation. So this patient had 65%. So another thing I forgot to tell you here, 97.2, but the age of the patient was more than 70 years. Very unlikely it is a germline. So we have not insisted on germline aspect here. Whereas here, this 13-year-old child, and we see 65% burden of TP53 mutation. And of course, it's associated with poor survival. When we discussed the clinical history with the clinician, we understood that the patient's mother was affected with breast cancer and AML. And it was diagnosed early as leukemia. And so in such individuals, we would recommend looking at DNA obtained from the buccal swab just to rule out that this particular pathogenic mutation is not inherited from the mother for this particular subject. And here is another case of MDS. So it is MDS with deletion 5q and 7q. What we see here again is a TP53 mutation. Two different mutations are noted in this patient, and at codon 173 and 214, they are quite far apart in terms of the length or the stretch of DNA. So we could not talk about whether they belong to the same clone or a different clone. However, when you see the burden is pretty high. As we discussed earlier, the complex karyotype, presence of deletion 5q with karyotype and anomalies greater than 4 is associated with a poor survival. This is another case where a known case of CA breast operated 12 years ago and developed thrombocytopenia, and 5 years ago, and now she started showing progression, myelofibrosis on bone marrow aspirate. When we did the profiling, we observed that the JAK2 clone was there. In addition to that, we had the TP53 clone. So here I stop for any further questions on this session. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Vidya, for that insightful talk. I think we have a few questions in the question and answer window.
So, Dr. Vidya, one question of mine. When we talk about biallelic mutation for TP53, what does it mean? And does our report of MedGenome tells us whether it's monoallelic or biallelic? Because the prognostication changes with the biallelic mutations of TP53.
Yes, sir. So biallelic, just purely based on NGS, it is going to be difficult to address. But it has to be, it also depends on, when you say biallelic, is it loss of one copy and then a mutation in another copy? It is very, we have discussed this in the context of CEBP also. Shotgun sequencing has this limitation. We cannot, even if there were two mutations far apart in the TP53 gene, we cannot comment on whether it is monoallelic or biallelic, considering the complexity of the leukemic clone. However, there are methods out there which can, sorry, where is the thing? Which can determine the biallelic status. We are not offering that right now, sir.
So there is a question from Dr. Ashish. IHC for P53 also. How does it correlate with mutational status by sequencing?
So we cannot correlate. That is what I just discussed in the context of when we were discussing about what are the methods of choice. Another question raised by one more person. So when there is P53 IHC being positive, it could happen due to two reasons. That is, a functionally active P53 is overexpressed. That means the P53 is functioning really good to combat cancer, but that is not the situation here. If P53 was actually functioning well, the cancer would not have arisen. So often P53 IHC is associated with loss of P53 function. There are few clinical studies which have proved that a mutation in P53 is associated with increased expression on IHC. However, not every study which has looked at mutation has tried to prove that P53 expression and P53 mutation are similar. So in other words, by looking at IHC, we cannot predict anything about whether the P53 is active or not. The gold standard remains mutational analysis.
So the next question is from Dr. Naval. Can TP53 mutation be dormant? Does it always have to be associated with disease progression?
It depends upon the, so when we say mutation, a pathogenic mutation could never remain dormant. Okay, so what we are talking about here in the context of disease, when we talk about the context of disease and we are trying to search for a TP53 mutation, it is always a pathogenic mutation. Often a pathogenic mutation, as it is all evidence based. So based on the clinical evidence what we have, every time you detect a pathogenic mutation is often associated with a disease progression or aggressive disease phenotype. So just to keep it straight, TP53 mutation which is pathogenic may not remain dormant.
Okay. Next question is from Dr. Sumit. What is the concordance of TP53 by IHC versus FISH versus NGS?
So we cannot have this concordance done because different technologies are giving different answers. When we look at that slide where I showed how we evolve in understanding the human DNA, the answer that you get from FISH is completely different from the answer that you get from NGS. And it is totally different from what you get from the answer from IHC. So IHC is looking only at the protein level, whereas the FISH and NGS are looking at the DNA level. So it is like comparing apples to oranges. We cannot have a concordance done on these lines. So, but in an indirect way, in any clinical study, people would have done it for specific cohorts to look at. They had a unique cohort which had TP53 mutations. Often they would do this IHC workup on lymphoma studies. So when they done this mutation analysis, they would have done the FISH also. They would, so as I said in the previous slides, one of the slides in the myeloma workup also, there is something called as the double hit mechanism for TP53. If one allele loses function, there should be a second hit in order that the cancer is onset. So people have looked at FISH and NGS and tried to compare and see that often a deletion P leads to an aggressive phenotype is also associated with a mutation in TP53. And then the same cohort they would have addressed for IHC. So it is completely cohort dependent and disease subtype dependent. That would have been done for the different leukemia subtypes. So generically we cannot comment on this on a generic state, on a platform, generic platform.
Okay, the next question is again from Dr. Naval. If the TP53 detection is dependent on the number of plasma cells, then bone marrow may be inaccurate as the disease is patchy. Can the NGS for myeloma for MRD be done on peripheral blood?
NGS, so there are two different questions here.
Yes.
Right? So we look for the plasma cell count, whether it is marrow or peripheral blood. We have a cutoff for the number of plasma cells or the burden of plasma cells present. Based on that, only the sample is accepted to take it forward for any further testing, particularly the FISH method. When it comes to NGS for myeloma, we do not have much experience on that for MRD as of now. We can look into that and see. It again depends on what marker we are looking, and did we assess this patient at baseline, and did we do an NGS for the patient at baseline, so that the same marker can be followed up on MRD in subsequent follow-up events on peripheral blood. So it's a workup. So one has to look at it in that context. So you take like what we have always seen, and Dr. Rahul has been extensively using, our comprehensive leukemia panel is a spectrum of 57 genes. You make an imprint of a given leukemia or a lymphoma patient with that imprint of 57 genes. So you have a spectrum with you, which you can use it as a torch to follow up this patient during his subsequent follow-ups as you start treating the patient to assess his MRD on NGS. On the same lines, one has to look at a myeloma panel to address the NGS-based myeloma assessment for MRD. I hope my answer has been clear. I mean, we can take this question again if that is not what Dr. Naval wants from us.
Sure. If Dr. Naval writes this question in the window again, we will take it up. Next question is again related from Dr. Astha Gupta. Is plasma cell sorting needed for TP53 mutation by NGS?
Ideally, it would enrich the population of cells which are actually TP53 mutated. That would actually increase the diagnostic accuracy of detecting a TP53 mutation on NGS also. However, the NGS technology being a highly sensitive technology, the reason why we need to do a plasma cell enrichment on a FISH is we are looking at 200 cells on an average when we are trying to score for a deletion 17p. Whereas in NGS, we are looking at millions of cells which are getting ruptured and their DNA is getting released. And all these DNA fragments are being subjected, of course, it's a probabilistic event. It's being subjected to sequencing. Therefore, the sensitivity with which you can pick up a mutation, even if you have not done a plasma cell sorting, is still there. But, as a recommendation, the ERIC guidelines, myeloma guidelines do not recommend that one has to do a plasma cell sorted sample. However, it improves the diagnostic yield. What is your experience percentage?
So the next question is from Dr. Indrani. What is your experience with percentage of TP53 not deleted by FISH, but mutation positive in PCR, especially in CLL?
Honestly, I do not have this information right now offhand. We can look into that and get back to you.
Sure. The next question is from Dr. Sumit. He's saying, I have a case of AML with 17q deletion. Will it also have a bad prognosis like 17p deletion?
I'm not sure about this. We have to read through the literature. We can read and we can get back to him.
Sure. So we will get back to Dr. Indrani and Dr. Sumit with answers to their questions in a few days' time. There is one question from Dr. Aditya that we just received. Subclonal TP53 mutant clones, variant allele frequency less than 10% in CLL. Guidelines say that they shouldn't guide treatment decisions. Is there any data to suggest that they can spontaneously disappear?
Not that I'm aware of, but we can again look at it and get back to him if there is any clinical study that has reported.
Sure, Dr. Vidya. So that's about it for the webinar. I would like to thank Dr. Rahul Bhargava again for
Thank
helping
you.
us organize.
Thank you everybody for joining on this webinar. It's an enlightening thing about TP53. Next couple of days, we will work on, probably next week or in 10 days, we'll come back to inherited bone marrow failure syndromes. Vidya and Arun will be requiring your help to understand inherited bone marrow failure syndromes. How do we diagnose them? It's a great series, getting great reviews by everybody. People are liking it, and the video recordings have been spread across Africa to Middle East, and people are really liking. Thanks, MedGenome, and thanks everybody for participating into this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rahul.